The Cleveland torso murderer was an unidentified serial killer who was active in Cleveland, Ohio, United States in the 1930s. The killings were characterized by the dismemberment of 13 known victims and the disposal of their remains in the impoverished neighborhood of Kingsbury Run. Most victims came from an area east of Kingsbury Run called the Roaring Third, or Hobo Jungle, known for its bars, gambling dens, brothels, and vagrants. The official number of murders attributed to the Cleveland torso murderer is 12, although recent research has shown there could have been as many as 20 or more. The 12 known victims were killed between 1935 and 1938. Some investigators, including lead detective Peter Murillo, believed that there may have been 13 or more victims in the Cleveland, Youngstown, and Pittsburgh areas between the 1920s and 1950s. The victims of the torso murder were usually drifters whose identities were never determined, although there were a few exceptions. Victims numbers 2, 3, and 8 were identified as Edward Andrassy, Florence Polillo, and possibly Rose Wallace, respectively. Edward Andrassy, victim number 2, and Florence Polillo, victim number 3, were both identified by their fingerprints, while Rose Wallace, victim number 8, was tentatively identified via her dental records. The victims appeared to be lower-class individuals, easy prey in Depression-era Cleveland. Many were known as working poor. The torso murderer always beheaded and often dismembered the victims, occasionally severing the victim's torso in half or severing their appendages. In many cases, the cause of death was the decapitation or dismemberment itself. Most of the male victims were castrated. Some victims showed evidence of chemical treatment being applied to their bodies, which caused the skin to become red, tough, and leathery. Many of the victims were found after a considerable period of time following their deaths, occasionally in excess of a year. In an era when forensic science was largely in its infancy, these factors further complicated identification, especially since the heads were often undiscovered. During the time of the official murders, Elliot Ness, leader of the Untouchables, held the position of Public Safety Director of Cleveland, a position with authority over the police department and ancillary activities, including the fire department. Ness contributed to the arrest and interrogation of one of the prime suspects, Dr. Francis Sweeney. In addition, Ness personally conducted raids into the hobos' shanties and eventually burned down Kingsbury Run, from which the killer took their victims. His reasoning for burning down the shanty towns was to catalog fingerprints to easily identify new victims, and stated that it was also done to get possible victims out of the area in an attempt to stop the murders. They had evicted 300 individuals from the area and burned down approximately 100 shanty homes in a desperate attempt to weed out the killer. 4 days after the shantytown burning, on August 22, 1938, Ness launched an equally draconian operation of questionable legality, where he personally dispatched 6 two-man search teams on a large area of Cleveland under the guise of conducting city fire inspections. While the search never turned up any new or incriminating information that could lead to the arrest and conviction of the torso murderer, the systemic search did serve to focus renewed public attention on the inadequate and unsanitary living conditions in the downtown Cleveland area. The teams uncovered hundreds of families living in hazardous fire traps without toilets or running water. The interests of social reform did ultimately come to light, even if those of law enforcement did not. At one point in time, the killer taunted Ness by placing the remains of 2 victims in full view of his office in City Hall. The man who Ness believed was the killer would later also provoke him by sending him postcards. In December 1938, the torso murderer allegedly sent a letter to Elliot Ness, claiming that he had moved to California and killed a woman there and had buried the head in southwest Los Angeles. In the letter, the killer referred to himself as a DC, or Doctor of Chiropractic. An investigation uncovered animal bones. A decade later, this confession in the letter resulted in authorities considering the possibility that the Cleveland torso murder case had some connection to the Black Dahlia murder. The mutilated remains of a 22-year-old Elizabeth Short were found in a vacant lot in an unfinished Leimert Park housing development of Los Angeles on January 15, 1947. Both Elizabeth and the torso murder victims had been thoroughly cleaned after death, and a butcher knife was believed to have been used in both cases. However, Short was not decapitated, as was a signature for the Cleveland victims. Furthermore, the murder took place near a decade after the letter was received. Aside from the circumstantial evidence and sheer speculation, there is nothing connecting the Black Dahlia case with the killings in Ohio. Authorities interrogated around 9,100 people during the investigation to find the torso murderer. The case became the biggest police investigation in Cleveland history. Many were investigated, and 1,000 crimes were solved from the dedicated police investigations. There were only two main suspects of the torso murders, Frank Dolezal and Francis Sweeney. On August 24, 1939, a 52-year-old Cleveland resident named Frank Dolezal, who at one point lived with Polillo and also had connections to Andrassy and Wallace, was arrested as a suspect. He later died in suspicious circumstances. He was posthumously exonerated of the involvement in the torso slayings. Another suspected individual was Dr. Francis Sweeney. Sweeney was a veteran of World War I who was part of a medical unit that conducted amputations in the field. After the war, Sweeney became an alcoholic due to pathological anxiety and depression derived from his wartime experiences. His heavy drinking began in 1929. By 1934, his alcoholism led to a separation from his wife. Additionally, during his military service, Sweeney was gassed in combat, which resulted in nerve damage. Sweeney was later personally interviewed by Elliot Ness. Before the interrogation, Sweeney was detained, and he was found to be so intoxicated that he was held in a hotel room for 3 days until he sobered up. During this interrogation, Sweeney is said to have failed to pass 2 very early polygraph machine tests. Both tests were administered by a polygraph expert who told Ness he had his man. Ness apparently felt there was little chance of obtaining a successful prosecution of the doctor, especially as he was the first cousin of one of Ness's political opponents, who had hounded Ness publicly about his failure to catch the killer. After Sweeney committed himself, there were no more leads or connections that police could assign to him as a possible suspect. From his hospital confinement, Sweeney sent threatening postcards and harassed Ness and his family into the 1950s. The postcards only stopped arriving after his death. Sweeney died in Veterans Hospital in Dayton on July 9, 1964. In 1997, another theory postulated that there may have been no single killer, and that these murders could have been committed by different people. This was based on the assumption that the autopsy results were inconclusive. Detective Peter Murillo believed that the torso murderer could be a transient who was riding the rails, aka a hobo. Most of the murders occurred within the vicinity of railroad tracks. Murillo went undercover as a hobo to investigate this area. He believed that this was the reason why there were murders in other states that were similar to the torso murders in Cleveland. In popular culture, the 2018 film The Kingsbury Run was based on a modern copycat of the murders. The murders and the hunt for the perpetrators were covered in an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. At the time of this recording, the case remains unsolved.